Hello, and welcome to WITA's Friday Exchange. We're recording this week's episode on Friday, November 21st at 9 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time. So, depending on when you download and listen, the trade issues we're discussing today may have changed. Of course, if you followed our podcast or the news, you know that there have been weekly and sometimes daily trade announcements coming from the Trump administration. Last week, the president announced he was removing so-called reciprocal tariffs on things we don't grow in the U.S. or don't make here, things like coffee, cocoa, and bananas. And I saw just last night they announced more agricultural products from Brazil that are now exempt from tariffs, including some tropical fruits. And I saw that there were bread, pastries, and cakes used for religious purposes, which I didn't know was a thing. So today we've brought back the OG team to help us understand some of what's going on around the world as the trade news never stops. Welcome back to the Exchange podcast to Wendy Cutler, Senior Vice President at the Asia Society Policy Institute and former acting Deputy U.S. Trade Representative, Mark Linscott, Senior Advisor with the Asia Group and a former Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for South and Central Asia and WTO and Multilateral Affairs, Dan Mullaney, non-resident Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, former Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Europe and the Middle East, and our discussion leader today, Joe DeMond, Chair of International Trade Policy and Global Life Sciences at Crowell Global Advisors, and a former Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Rep for Asia and the Pacific. Joe?
Thank you, Ken, and good morning, Wendy, Mark, and Dan. Another interesting week. I think that Ken mentioned the big headline, which we'll come to, of removal of tariffs on certain agricultural and other products, which happened, I think, minutes after our discussion last Friday. So we were unable to cover that, but we'll get to it.
Can we take
today.
credit for that?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, we we hinted dimly that it would be bad not to do that, and somehow it came out. But there were some other interesting developments this week that maybe didn't make the national headlines the way the ag tariffs did, but are nonetheless important and give us all sort of some insights into what the administration is up to, I think. So let's start with the one trade agreement that was concluded in the last week or so, and it maybe isn't totally out because I don't think we've seen the text yet, which is with the sort of small but important country of Switzerland, with whom we do a lot of trade. Just to review, and I'm going to turn to Dan for further insight. Switzerland was hit with very high reciprocal tariffs, much higher than the rest of Europe, 39%. Something went wrong in that process. There's been a negotiation process ever since, and then there was some visits from Swiss people to the White House, to Washington to resolve these issues, and apparently they succeeded. One thing, and I'll turn it over to you, Dan Mullaney, because you're all things EU. We'll start with Europe, I should say, not just EU. Let's start with you. And this one was brokered in kind of an interesting way, too, in that there were private sector participants or representatives going to the White House. There were some gifts exchanged there that may have had something to do with it. And then I suppose the negotiators had something to do with it, too. But what's your understanding of what happened to sort of reach, after this bad start, to reach this conclusion?
Well, I think they started off weeks or months ago on a good path, on a similar path to Europe, with a lot of the negotiators negotiating terms for an agreement with Switzerland, and then there was just a really bad call at senior levels, and that was pretty much that. I think there was maybe a sense that Switzerland, didn't necessarily take the trade deficit, which with Switzerland is huge because of pharmaceuticals and optical equipment and other things. And so I think there was a sense that and I think incorrect probably, but a sense that somehow the Swiss weren't sensitive to the priorities of the administration. And so they walked away and said, that's it, 39%. I had kind of anticipated that you might need to wait for, say, the next rotating president in Switzerland, which would have been in January, to get a clean slate. But as you said, I think a bunch of executives came in, kind of, reset what was maybe kind of a mistake, if you will, or a miscommunication early on. And we ended up probably with, in part, the deal that was teed up a while back. Except that I think what's interesting about the deal is that you had the UK deal, which was very early on, that hinted at a lot of non-tariff barriers that needed to be addressed. You had the EU agreement in August, which had more details. And then the Swiss agreement, I think, maybe given the extra time, you're really spelling out a lot of the non-tariff barriers that need to be part of discussions. And a lot of the issues are things that are almost some of our traditional issues that have shown up in our FTAs over the years. Things like the statement on standards of the WTO for recognition of international standards, and a whole series of things which are spelled out in, I think, a lot more detail than is set out in the UK deal back in the spring, and then the EU deal in the summer. So we have this progression, which I think Switzerland is the latest manifestation of much more detailed spelling out of what the trading partners are agreeing to with respect to non-tariff barriers.
So technically speaking, where does this actually stand? I mean, you said there's a lot more detail in there, but there's always more detail to do, right, in terms of implementation. So and market access. So are all these? I assume there's still things to be done to actually conclude what we would consider, a final agreement. Or
yeah, I would say so, and that's actually an interesting point, because I was looking at some of the other agreements, like with Malaysia and Cambodia, and there are some fairly specific obligations spelled out with respect to things like good regulatory practices, recognition of approval of medical devices, a whole series of things which, as I say, would end up specifically in an agreement. And so I think ultimately that's where the administration is going on these non-tariff barriers, not let's have a plan to discuss them and have dialogues going forward, but actually have firm agreements on these things. And so the Swiss agreement, I think, points to a lot of areas where the parties need to sit down and reach an agreement. I think in this time they weren't able to lay out some of the details that you maybe find in the Malaysian statement. But I think the next step is sitting down and reaching a agreement, which the EU is beginning to feel, I guess, the effects of in terms of what are those next steps with respect to NTVs and the question of how that's going.
If I can just add, the fact sheet on the Swiss agreement does say that there will be detailed negotiations. What I found interesting, it says early next year. And so it suggests, I thought that, the administration was trying to wrap up all these deals by the end of the year. But this suggests that there is kind of a timetable with all of these countries that we kind of keep hearing about.
And I've got a related question. The new reciprocal tariff, when does that kick in? So, when does Switzerland start to reap the benefits of doing this deal?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, with the EU deal, it happened, I think, fairly quickly, within a month. And so I'd anticipate that would be fairly quick on for the Swiss agreement as well. But I don't think an exact timetable has been laid out. But like I say, with the EU, we went very quickly, and of course, in exchange for the EU starting a process to remove the tariffs. And Switzerland probably has less of a process than the EU, so the sequencing there might be a little different, a little closer in time, which may be good, because I think that's maybe tripping up the EU a little bit.
So I think you covered. I think I missed some of that, Dan, but you were covering what the rationale for what's going on between the U.S. and the EU right now. Greer and Lutnick going to Europe. Is that right? Sorry.
I hadn't quite got. We were mostly talking about the sequencing, I think, for the Swiss deal.
Okay. Okay. Good.
You have a component of that, which is the tariffs, and when the tariffs kick in. And with the EU deal, it happened pretty quickly. with the EU-Swiss deal, I imagine it will as well. The EU, in exchange for getting the tariff commitments implemented from the United States, said they would start a process for reducing tariffs on their side. And I think that process on the tariff side for the EU has been going maybe a little bit longer than anticipated by the administration. And I think also there's been a lot of public statements from the parliament about the need for amendments and additions and conditions and caveats and things. And I think that's making the administration a bit nervous that maybe is the EU really on track even for the relatively simple, concrete, and straightforward tariff part of this. So I think that's part of the reason for Jameson going to Brussels. But then there's this whole other aspect, which is all the non-tariff barrier issues, which, as I say, remarkably, as time goes on, all those non-tariff barriers and other issues map pretty closely on our own previous FTA. So this is not unknown territory. And in the EU deal, I think there are about three and a half paragraphs on tariffs, and then total of 19 paragraphs, and most of those other paragraphs have to do with these NTBs. And I think on this podcast a few months ago, I thought that maybe this big chunk of the agreement where you're addressing the non-tariff barriers was maybe a time bomb, because between then, which was then August or September, and the end of the year, you really had a certain amount of time for engagement to really try to address these non-tariff barriers. And again, these are many things that we've discussed in the TTIP negotiations and the TTC negotiations and the executive working group discussions under Trump 1. And back in September, I said, that could go one of two ways. One, we actually appreciate that this is a moment of urgency and we really need to be creative and address those issues. Or two, it ends up being an exercise in playing for more time and rope-a-dope. And I think there's maybe a little bit of concern right now that the sense of urgency to really address some of those non-tariff barriers, which, as I said, are fairly well known, fairly traditional, fairly historic. Maybe that's not going quite as well as it should. And so I think this notion of a ticking time bomb, where somebody literally wakes up on in December and says, so how are we doing with all these unfair practices that we need to address with Europe? And if the answer is, well, we don't have much, or yeah, we have a plan to discuss, to form a committee to discuss, this could go pretty badly. It could be a time bomb in these negotiations.
Let me ask a question about that. I think you kind of hinted at it a little bit. Is the administration's leverage seeping a little bit on this? I mean, is there really a threat that the administration will reapply a much higher reciprocal tariff to the EU if they don't resolve these issues? Do they have credibility on that? Or is it what we've discussed before, just that there's so many things that the US can do to hurt you that you still have an incentive to play ball with the US?
Well, I think the EU and maybe others have a hope that the zero tariffs could be extended to other products, like wine and spirits was in line. I think there was a hope that the agreement could be improved from a tariff perspective. And we've seen some of those improvements. You mentioned them at the outset, products that we don't produce. I said there's a hope for wine and spirits and maybe some other products. But if it goes off the wires, does the administration have tools to put in place new tariffs? I think absolutely. I mean, we've talked a lot about 232, and a lot of there's been a lot of the administration's been holding its fire, I think, on a lot of these 232s and derivative products. So I think absolutely. To my mind, if the discussions go off the rails in terms of either the tariff commitments or in terms of doing something meaningful on these NTBs, I do have a sense that the administration could pull the trigger on significant other tariffs. And of course, some of that depends on how the Supreme Court comes out on IEEPA. But as we've said over and over again, if there's not IEEPA, there's 232, there's 301, there's 338, there's 122, there's that whole.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think we keep raising this just because I think out in the broader world at large, there's this sense that if the administration loses IEPA, that somehow its tariff strategy policy will crumble. But I think we keep reminding people that's not really the way it's going to work. We think it's going to work. Mark, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, it does raise a lot of interesting questions. I think we discussed this a bit last week of, how do these deals work? What will be, there's no dispute settlement. There's no, real bilateral process in any of these deals about, what happens if there's a U.S. perception that a trading partner is violating or not following through with implementation of commitments it had negotiated. What then happens? Is it like an immediate action by Trump that says, okay, I'm raising the tariff and it's the sledgehammer approach? Or is it, I wonder if we got a little hint of that with Korea. And, I really would be interested to hear Wendy's perspectives on that. With the threat of 301 on the digital issues, is 301 going to be, the tool for enforcement, which does have a process associated with that? It's not simply the president saying, we're doing this and it happens tomorrow. And, I don't know that we can answer these questions now because we're getting mixed signals. But I did think that the threat of, and I know we're going to get into, the Korea specific kind of context, but the threat of 301 being, an enforcement kind of tool, at least threatened with Korea. How will that play with the EU, if the EU's not following through, or any country that may not be following through? I mean, that's a big question mark.
Oh,
Wendy,
you're on mute, Wendy.
When, next week's meeting between Greer and Lutnick and the EU, this really has the potential to be a train wreck. And this is why, the reason I say that, and is really underscoring what Dan just said, is that I think each side has very different objectives for this meeting. I think the US wants to hold the EU's feet to the fire and see progress in getting rid of these barriers that they agreed to. But the EU has been very public in terms of, saying that its position is going to be seeking lots more exceptions to these tariffs in sectors from distilled spirits to medical devices to products that I'm sure Dan knows very well that this is not going to be an easy exercise. So it's something worth watching and again, could be very contentious.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Jameson, and I'm not sure that Jameson and Secretary Lutnick are all that coordinated in there in going over to Brussels, to be perfectly frank. But I think Jameson is going over there to say, well, what's happening with this legislative process to do these tariffs? And I think also what's become increasingly clear with these other agreements is that the administration is interested in, I think, hard obligations like agreement type language on these NTBs, on the standards, on intellectual property, on sanitary, phytosanitary, on recognition of approval of medical devices and a whole host of other things. And the EU is always a little challenged when it comes to having an agreement because if you're going to have an agreement like the administration might be looking for, then you need a mandate from the member states. And it's kind of a heavy process to get a mandate to negotiate an agreement. So from the EU's perspective, they have to kind of, deal with that requirement in Europe that there be a mandate and yet somehow, reach some understanding that is maybe, almost an agreement, but not an agreement. So I think that's part of the challenge. And I think you're probably right. I mean, the EU in part is, they want some exemptions. And I think they also, have a long history with the EU of, saying, well, let's sit down, let's have a discussion, let's address these issues over time. And I think the administration, their history with this, I think their view of this is that the EU is always trying to just delay and delay and delay. I'm not saying that that's true at all, but I think it's definitely the perception on the administration side that the EU is always looking for a dialogue, which then just sort of puts off any real outcome. And I think the administration is looking for, an outcome in agreed language, agreed text, more like we're seeing in some of the other agreements. which is kind of ironic because of course the administration is criticized for having these framework agreements that are very soft and smushy and aspirational and aren't real. Everybody, when they say framework agreement, they always put little air quotes around agreement. Well, now I think the administration really does want to see, okay, let's see something firm, and it's the real question as to what the other trading partners are going to be able to step up and do.
Yeah. But I wanted to go back to Mark's point too about, I think with the Korea example, and get Wendy's thoughts on this too, because nothing in these agreements, there's an enforcement provision, but also nothing in the agreements prevents the administration from raising new issues from its perspective that come up over time. That's in a way of looking at what they did on the 301 on Korea. It's like, so the world, the country or the world thinks we have sort of peace, a truce between the two sides or an agreement. And then the administration says, oh, wait a minute, one more thing. We really don't like your digital policies. So, and the country's like, well, wait a minute. I just wonder if that creates, confusion or frustration on the part of countries that it's really never done, that the administration can just keep raising new issues, regardless of what kind of, and making threats about tariffs, even though you think you have a deal with them.
Yeah, I think that is true, and that is the perception of the trading partners. But we should keep in mind that even when you have one of those comprehensive big agreements, even our traditional ones, there are all kinds of committees that are set up to address issues, and there are always new issues coming up that you're working on, and any one of those could throw things off the rails. So it's a lot less concrete than it was in the past, but it's not entirely different. I mean, all of these agreements have new issues that arise and questions whether like this agreement says you will not discriminate in your digital policies. It's a simple statement, and maybe in an FTA you would have had something that was much more spelled out, but you would still have discussions of issues and as they arose. So it's different. It's looser, but it's not not hugely qualitatively different, at least not in.
Oh, and the U.S. always had 301 authority to raise issues at any time, and 232, although wasn't used as frequently as recently. Before we move off Europe and the EU, I wanted to ask about another item that people may have missed that was in the press this week, in the trade press, that the EU was actually was at a meeting of the members of CPTPP and exploring some sort of collaborative process, I don't know what you want to call it, on that, which kind of is another indication that countries are looking for ways of developing their trade ties around the issues that they have with the United States. I mean, to diversify their trade, their exports, and not be as reliant, et cetera. And so how do people interpret that? And what do people know what actually happened at these meetings and where that might be going?
So look, this meeting was significant, right? So at the annual meeting of the CPTPP trade ministers, with Australia the host this year, the EU commissioner, or the EU trade commissioner, joined. And in a separate group of meetings, the ASEANs also had separate dialogue with the CPTPP members. And as you mentioned, Joe, I think this just underscores that countries are looking for ways to reduce their dependence on the United States and to bolster ties and deepen trade ties with other countries. The fact that the EU now has expressed interest in collaborating with the CPTPP countries is an important development on the trade front. But I was struck by a few things in the statement that was issued by the CPTPP describing the dialogue. And first, I would just say a lot of words in that agreement, and very little action. They talk about how they need results, but they're also putting off coming up with a work program until next year. So this is going to be kind of a slow process, and I'm a bit skeptical in terms of what concrete things they can actually do. They've in the statement, they identify 5 issues for the work program, including digital trade as well as diversification and trade facilitation. So pretty broad topics. But again, I do think that this is, it is a significant, event. That's something we should kind of watch closely and see what comes out of this process. At the same time, the CPTPP members met under Australia leadership this year. They did agree after 3 years of reviewing the agreement. We talked about how all these agreements need updates. They've now agreed that they're going to start negotiating next year. Again, a very slow process. And they identified a number of areas, including digital, where they do want to, proceed with negotiations. And they included customs and services as well. They also sorted through all of these countries and economies that have expressed interest in joining, and did mention that come next year, 2026, they're going to look at Uruguay, the Philippines, Indonesia, and the UAE as prospective candidates for accession. So I do think CPTPP now is finally getting some momentum after kind of being a sleeper agreement, for at least in my view, for the past several years. And it does seem that more attention is being paid to it, and partners, as they look to diversify, are looking at CPTPP as being an important avenue to proceed with.
Yeah,
Right.
go ahead, Dan.
Go ahead, Mark.
I, I was going to say, from the beginning, the EU had a two-part strategy when it came to the US. One is they decided they were going to engage and come up with these framework agreements and do that. But the other part of this was to build up all their ties with other partners. And so, we really gave, what the Trump administration did, really gave a shot in the arm to the EU's efforts with respect to India, Gulf Cooperation Council, and now CPTPP. So, that was, I think, from early days, that was part of the EU strategy. What will be, for me, will be interesting to watch is that there was early on, there was a hint that part of that outreach to other partners would be to create kind of a coalition of the willing to push back on the administration. That's one approach. Or the other approach, of course, is just to build up ties so that you're sufficiently diversified, so you're not subject to so much leverage from the United States. So I think Wendy's cautionary tale about how close they really are aligned based on the statements, I think is a good one. I mean, I think that's probably, that latter aspect is probably not going to happen. But I think this is clearly a implementation of a strategy, which is to broaden integration with other allies and get some other allies on board with EU positions on things like digital, where the EU feels very different from the United States.
If I could just add to this, because I think this is, as Wendy emphasizes, this is, a process, and, it's hard to know how it may play out. It could be long term, but it is occurring in a vacuum, in the sense that, the WTO is on the sidelines. The WTO has been powerless for a long, long time to kind of deal with the fragmentation that's been going on. This precedes the first Trump administration. But there have been, I think it makes sense to have questions about where the entire system is going, and whether CPTPP might be a platform for kind of filling that vacuum.
Yeah.
In terms of consolidation. There's fragmentation, but then where does the consolidation take place where the WTO pretty much, it's never going to reach its heyday again. And might CPTPP be a platform for that over the long term? And this isn't like something that's going to happen in the next few years, but over the longer term. And, even going back to, taking the historical view on this, even going back to, the Doha round collapsing in the WTO, the WTO in some respects going belly up. The US was negotiating both TPP at the time and TTIP. And, it was interesting because a lot of other countries, particularly the likes of India, were beginning to wonder, could a regional agreement like TPP or TTIP start to, as the US hedging its bets and potentially looking to leave the WTO, and gravitating to these new regional blocks. And the ironic thing is that we may start to see that, but the U.S. is not in the picture at all.
I just want just a couple of points, and maybe I don't know if these are provocative or not. First of all, I've never heard anybody say this, but would the TPP, CPTPP even have been done if it hadn't been for the engine of the U.S. pushing for the original TPP agreement in the first place? Could you have gotten a group of countries like this together to make an agreement? I mean, the U.S. eventually pulled out of it, but we were the ones that put it together, and the rest of the countries took what they liked from and then removed a few of the issues. The second thing is, I think I go back to Wendy's point. It could be an alternative. I mean, you're right about, everything obviously, Mark, you said about the WTO seems to me correct. But if this is an alternative, this cannot operate at the same glacial pace that if 5 years from now, the CPP is still talking about, the shape of the table and it's nothing but empty words. And Wendy didn't say empty, but there was a lot of verbiage in that. Then is it any better? Is it any more functional than the multilateral trading system itself?
Yeah.
One thing that's interesting is that I think actually TPP started with other countries than the United States, and then
yeah,
a big thing. So would it have started without the United States? I think probably the answer is yes. The other thing that's interesting, and it's really useful to look at a lot of these agreements as they come out, because the number of references to WTO disciplines and agreement of the parties to comply with international standard setting, for instance, which is the ultimate in kind of standards harmonization. The fisheries agreement, the government procurement agreement was in one of the agreements. I mean, the number of times that the U.S. now is pointing to WTO obligations as being the sort of an important element I think is fascinating to me.
It's an a la carte. It's an a la carte approach, though. It's not. It's not really expressing a renewed commitment to the WTO as an institution. And certainly in terms of disciplines on tariffs, it's a la carte in terms of in TBT, we reaffirm, all of those kinds of disciplines. So.
But they are the multilateral disciplines. I mean, it's interesting. You're right. It's not necessarily a commitment to the organization, but it seems to be a recognition that the multilateral rules that are set up in the WTO have a lot of value and are kind of
they're what we have, but a difference, of course. I mean, so there is a global reference point here for people to use. But I agree with what Mark said about the a la carte approach. I'd also note that just because you're asking them to adhere to WTO obligate or disciplines in some cases does not mean that the WTO is going to be the way that they're enforced. There's not going to be dispute settlement under the WTO. That's a big difference. I wouldn't think. I mean, the U.S., if to the extent that it's demanding that other countries meet WTO standards, intends to enforce those commitments unilaterally the way it does all these other trade agreements. And that's a big difference, I think, if the WTO is not functional on the back end of these commitments.
Mm-hmm. So for me, like looking ahead for the CPTPP to remain and really become a credible alternative, I really think it needs to attract some other kind of important members. And here I mean by the size of their economy. I'm not, don't want to pass judgment on whether Costa Rica is important or not. But I think like an Indonesia or Korea joining would really change the calculus. And if that was going forward at the same time this EU dialogue was really taking off, and combined with negotiations to update the agreement, you could see the stars aligning and CPTPP becoming more of a driving force of kind of the next step in a troubled international global trading system. But those are a lot of hypotheticals. And one thing that I would just share, that being a leader in these group negotiations is very difficult. And with the U.S. stepping out, I mean, stepping out of the agreement. We did see Japan, once we left, rally the other countries and bring that agreement together. But in my sense, Japan isn't really playing that role. Australia, as hosts, played the role this year, but each year they have a rotating chairmanship. Next year will be Vietnam. And so, we'll have to see how, like in any given year, how much could be done given that there's a different chair.
Yeah. So there's still a lot that needs to, I mean, there's clearly, the bottom line seems, as we were saying, there's clearly a lot of interest in exploring these various alternatives, but it still remains to be seen how effective they are and what impact they have on the global trading system and what impact they have on countries like the US as well going forward. So we'll see. Let's switch gears a little bit to just briefly talk about some of the other news that came out this week, which was, as we said at the beginning, right after our podcast last week, that the administration announced that it was lowering or eliminating tariffs actually on a range of primarily agricultural products. The list was quite long. I think there's been a lot of news reporting in the last week on this, but as for us, speaking as from trade officials, trade negotiators, what do you all make of what the administration did and what that reflects about their policy and how they're responding to signals in the marketplace too, like prices? Who wants to start?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I mean, look, it clearly underscores the domestic pressure that the administration is under and the growing unpopularity of these tariffs as they are linked directly to increased prices in the supermarkets and elsewhere. So I think this is just the beginning. I think we're going to see many more product exceptions and exclusions going forward. Again, where the president can boast about these high tariffs, but when you actually look at the application, that the tariffs are actually applied to a smaller and smaller subset of goods.
I mean, I think we even predicted that as the pressure, everybody has said the tariffs are a costly and blunt tool for achieving these objectives. We thought as the costs became apparent that there was maybe going to be some flexibility. I think that's what we're seeing. I mean, in a way, we've lived in a system where the presumption is tariffs are zero, and then in extraordinary circumstances, you raise them. And now we've moved to a point where, okay, the tariffs are high, and now we're looking for, oh, well, this input is hurting U.S. manufacturing, so we better give an exemption there. And, oh, these tariffs are hitting consumer price, so we got to eliminate those. So in a way, it's just sort of a shifting of presumption as to whether you start at 15% and what do you take away versus starting at 0 or 1 and what do you add?
Well, what really bothers me about all this, one thing that bothers me about what's happening, totally agree with what you said, Dan, is the non-transparency of what's going on. This wasn't an administration list. I think a lot of the products on there were not surprises, but as you said, there could be additional ones. Wendy and Dan, you said there could be additional ones going on. And let me just tell you, there's kind of a mini feeding frenzy going on around town, I think, of private sector groups who want to get some item exempted because it's not produced or not sufficiently supplied from U.S. sources. But there's no formal process. This is all going on behind the scenes. Nobody, people who might be on the other side of these issues are not being given the chance to comment. We don't know what it takes really to get, one thing people think it takes is to talk to the right person at a very high level in one of these government agencies, maybe even in the White House, to do that. And so once again, trade policy, I think we've all talked before about Congress not having a role. Now it's, or a much diminished role. But this whole tariff policy, it's not only that it's so volatile and changeable, it's just totally non-transparent. And I think that's worrisome. I mean, not to have some sort of public review and comment and some sort of transparent process with criteria. This is what's going on, though, in Washington.
I mean, but I think that's all true. And that's going to be true, I think, for the rest of this administration. It's not going to be transparent. It's not going to be highly predictable. But I think Wendy's and Dan's points are really important in terms of this development being significant. It's not likely to be one-off. It could be it looks like it will be sustained and potentially extended in terms of exempting more products from the tariffs, and then the scope of the tariffs that are applied start to diminish, and perhaps it could be even as important. And I don't want to get ahead of myself here or ahead of my skis, but um, uh, or over my skis, too far over my skis. Um, that it could be as important as what the Supreme Court decides on IEPA. This is the administration beginning to understand that there is substantial opposition to the tariffs, that it has political consequences, that those political consequences could really start to grow, and it's taking action on its own to reduce the scope and the level of the tariffs. And I already see it kind of playing out potentially in the situation with India, which remains in the worst position ever. Switzerland now has got its deal. Brazil's left. China's on its own track. Yet it got kind of a freebie here. With these exemptions that were just announced, some of the food products, spices, that's a big export item for India to the US market. There have been rumors that the semiconductor 232 is slowing down, which is beneficial to India because that could have some real impact. So it's even affecting the negotiating dynamics some, and even I think could go back to an earlier point you raised, Joe, at the start here of, are some of these tariffs, is the leverage kind of starting to slip a bit with some of these tariffs, as the administration seems to be waking up to the fact that they harm the US, and they need to rethink things a bit.
Yeah, I think you mentioned, Mark, just to add to that, the Section 232 cases for both pharmaceuticals and which also impacts India, and semiconductors, having been launched much earlier this year, and the deadlines have passed. Originally, we thought they were going to be announced in July, if you all remember, have not been announced. And what we're hearing, I think, is a lot of it is due to the complexity of these supply chains. These are critical products, and you don't want to get it wrong. For things that contain semiconductor chips or for medicines. I mean, because consumers will see that. These are critical products that people use every day of their lives. And it seems that the administration has taken pause a bit. I don't know if there is a pause, but they clearly, seem to be examining the process closely to try to avoid, some unintended consequences of these tariffs. So I think that's another indication, in addition to the announcement that came out last week on agricultural products. And I don't think any of us really know. And I do think, that the administration also did mention pharmaceuticals, at least in one of these announcements, that it's possible that some of those products can be excluded as well, from tariffs. So I think there is a sort of growing recognition.
I mean, the other thing that's going on in the broader political context is, the last set of elections maybe showed that people care about things like affordability and some of the domestic issues, and there may be a little bit of impatience with taking this really hard, tough line on tariffs and foreign partners. So there may be more. The pendulum may swing back more to sort of domestic issues and away from taking really tough lines with trade.
The White House did say this week, right, that the concept of affordability was going to become a big priority for the president, and that. We all know that there's a contradiction between affordability and applying tariffs on these products. So we'll see what that means for the president. Although I think, just as adamantly he believes just as adamantly in tariffs as he always has. But he's also being we're seeing a certain amount of pragmatism, right, from the administration.
I would just add, one more dynamic to watch, and it's somewhat related to this, but it's international, and that is to keep our trade truce with China intact. I think there is, a a desire by the administration not to do anything provocative vis-a-vis China that could unwind this tariff truce. So I don't know if it's accurate or not with respect to the semiconductor 232, but one of the things I have heard or read or whatever is that one of the reasons the administration may be putting off announcing tariffs under Section 232 is not to rock the boat with China right now, that they want to keep this truce intact. They want to, they want to reach agreement with China on the critical minerals regulations, where again, they announced an agreement, but each side had different interpretations in terms of which regulations were to be lifted and suspended versus which would stay in place. So the negotiations with China are continuing. But again, this truce is so fragile that any measure the U.S. takes, even if it's not directed at China, if it impacts China, we could be opening up that can of worms, something that the administration very much seems to want to keep, this truce in place.
Isn't that interesting? I mean, so that's actually an implicit indication of China's leverage, that you're avoiding taking action on other countries because it might impact China, which is supposed to be sort of at the center of the, if the administration's policy is driven around trade deficits and unfair practices, you'd think that, China would things forward, not causing this caution. It's, I think, really interesting.
Right. Well, China's critical minerals card is a real strong one, and one that I think is really, weakening the president's ability to threaten tariffs or export controls or other measures, because we know China will come right back and withhold those products, and that would have enormous implications
and while the
on our
administration,
companies.
and while the administration is exploring alternatives, it takes years. So there's really nothing they can do. Okay.
Can I just say, we've come a long way since April 2nd, Liberation Day. And, I'm thinking, I've got on my bookshelf here, Doug Irwin's, opus on clashing over commerce, which is really, really thick. He could probably write a new volume over the last 7 months, what has occurred that would be just as thick. I mean, it's just remarkable.
It is. I hope it'll be interesting when somebody writes the history of this someday. Some of us will probably want to read it. I don't know about the public at large. But anyway, we're timed out. There's so much more to talk about. It was great seeing you all today. So we'll finish. This is Joe DeMond. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week on WITA's Friday Exchange.
Thank you for watching and listening to WITA's Friday Exchange. WITA is the International Trade Membership Association. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. New episodes drop every Friday, and you'll be the first to know. Thank you for joining us, and we'll be back next week with WITA's Friday Exchange.